Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. After lunch session, we're all going to be a little bit tending to go for a nap. Hopefully, I'll keep you awake. But if you have a question, don't hesitate. Just lift your hand or stand up or jump or yell at me, and I'll hopefully be able to answer your question. I'm Nick Steenhout. I've been doing web accessibility stuff for about 20 years now. And I started when one of my friends in 1994 said, all these images everyone are talking about, it's really great to have that, but I'm blind, I use a screen reader, and I have no idea what you guys are talking about. So that really got me thinking about accessibility. In the last 20 years, I've evangelized about accessibility, and I have been quite active in open source. I was on the core team of Joomla when it first split from Mambo. I've worked with WordPress and several other systems, so I'm quite interested. I've also worked with a whole range of people with disabilities, so it's not just my own experience as a wheelchair user, but I have worked with and spoken with people of all kinds of disabilities. And when we think accessibility on the web, often we think, oh, it's people that use screen readers, which, of course, that's a large part of it, but it's not the only thing. So we're going to speak about some other things. It's not just about screen readers. So when we think about security, a lot of the time we think if it's easy to break, it's going to be hard to use. Or if we make it easy to use, then it's going to be easy to break. And while there's some truth to that, we can really get to a point where we have secure web applications that are usable by everyone. And this presentation is not going to give you all the answers. I'm going to tell you a little bit about different ideas that you can look at. It's really to get you thinking about these issues and seeing how you can improve and implement that in your work. It's really about reflection. We have to think about what we're doing, because if we don't think about what we're doing, we're going to end up going nowhere or repeating the mistakes we've made before. There's two examples of not thinking that really illustrate this very well that I like to talk about. The first one is the story about a guy who went to cash a check. His wife gave him a check, and he went to her bank, Bank of America in Florida, to cash the check. And their policy was a no exception policy that if you don't have an account to cash the check, you need to give a thumbprint. Slight detail, the guy was a double arm amputee. How could he give a thumbprint? He couldn't. The cashier said to him, well, I'm sorry, I understand. Obviously, you can do it, but we have this no exception policy, and we're offering you a workaround. You could open an account here, and then you don't need a thumbprint to cash this check. Well, that involved him going back home, getting documentation, and all that. And oh, wouldn't you know it, as part of opening the account, he had to give a thumbprint. This obviously is not a web-based example, but it's starting to think about how we establish policies that are on the surface are really a good idea. It's strong. It's protecting both the individual and the companies, but we have to think down the way. Maybe the answer here is not a no-exception policy, but is we'll give the branch manager some flexibility that if we encounter something that we just could not possibly plan for, then we have some flexibility. The other thing was a petition that was on the White House petitions website. If you don't know, the White House has a website that allows the public to create petitions, and then anyone can sign those petitions. This particular petition was to amend some part of copyright legislation that basically says if you buy ebooks with DRM, you can't media shift, so you can't take an ebook and transform it to an audiobook. So the changes were aimed at ensuring that people with disabilities using screen readers or people that can't actually handle a book easily could have access to that. Horrible detail. Nobody using a screen reader was able to sign the petition on the White House website because CAPTCHA was completely unusable. So the primary target, the primary people that were interested in actually getting this change, that wanted to sign the petition, couldn't. And they couldn't complain about it either because it's the White House, so if you want to send an email, you have to actually complete a CAPTCHA, which was also not accessible. The White House said, well, of course we're accessible. We comply fully with the guidelines of Section 508 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. We have a visual CAPTCHA, but we also provide an audio alternative, except that the audio alternative was not accessible. It was so garbled, nobody could understand it. We'll talk a little bit more about CAPTCHA. So here we have these things. We talked about easy to break, easy to use, and we have to make decisions along the way. In an ideal world, we would not have to protect ourselves from spam bots, from crackers, from everybody, but we're not living in an ideal world. In an ideal world, we wouldn't have to even think about accessibility. Everything would work straight out of the box. We have to make this happen. And there are some decisions that we're going to have to make that will exclude people at one point. So we have to be aware of that. We don't want 100,000 spam comments on our website, so we have to implement some form of verification to cut that out. Are the solution we're going to use going to be accessible to everyone? Well, let's hope so, but perhaps there will be this unforeseeable guy that comes in that doesn't have fingers, that can't give you a thumbprint. It's possible, so think about that. Think about possible competing needs, like the guy who is severely allergic to dogs, and suddenly there's a colleague who's blind who has a guide dog, and they both work in the same office. How does that impact? You know, who's more important? Do you sack the person that is allergic to dogs because, well, you obviously can't not hire this person simply because she has a guide dog? Or how do you approach that? Again, it's a question of reflection. Often it's a question of discussion with your users. Talk to your users, see what they want to do. But the bottom line is there's no right, there's no wrong. It's a continuum, and we have to pick the most accessible, most secure point along the continuum. Make sense so far? Still awake after lunch? Yeah, all right. Very briefly, there's three main areas that compel us to do accessibility, and I really don't want to start talking legalese here. I'm going to tell you, yes, you should be aware there are legislations out there that might apply to you. Whether you're in the United States, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, most of the Western world has some kind of legislation, whether it's a dedicated legislation that says, yes, all digital communication must be accessible, like Section 508 for federal governments in the United States, or it's simply human rights laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Bill of Rights in Canada, or different things. Basically, if you're interacting in the world, chances are there is some kind of legislation that applies to you. So if you have a question, come to me and I can cover that later after the talk, because we could speak for probably a whole week about legislation and not be covered. The other thing is there's a business case to be made for accessibility. Now, a lot of people are saying, yes, there's a business case to be made for accessibility, and if you implement accessibility, you will see an increase of 25% of revenue or more traffic. And, well, it's not that simple. We can do maths we can really impress people by saying, okay, there's 19% of people in the United States at the moment that have a disability. So that's roughly 1 in 5. So if we make the website accessible, you're going to have 20% more traffic. Now, it doesn't work that way because not everybody who has a disability has an impairment that actually impact their ability to navigate the web. And of those, well, maybe they'll be able to use the website and it's just a question of increased font size, or it could be anything. So we can't say every person with disability out there, if you make your website accessible, you will see that increased traffic, that increased revenue. On the other hand, a lot of my friends tend to go to website if they have a choice between one that's accessible and one that's not. Because they know I'm so into accessibility, they'll tend to go to an accessible website over one that isn't, if they're knowing about that. So yes, there's a business case. Yes, chances are that the more accessible your site is, your application is, the greater traffic and revenue you'll have. Very briefly, I was telling Christian earlier, just before the session started, Google is the largest blind screen reader user out there. Their search bot crawl your site, not exactly like a screen reader, but if your site isn't accessible, chances are that it's not going to be indexed quite as well. So it's something to think about in terms of business case. Yeah, let's make things accessible. But for me, the most important point, the most important thing is it's the right thing to do. In this day and age, social responsibility for corporation is something that becomes more and more important. So it's good for us to do it right, to not exclude people. It's also the right thing to do because in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, your eyesight is going to go, your hearing is going to go, and suddenly the things you've built now, you won't be able to use. So it's really for yourself that you're doing these things. And I'm repeating what Matt was saying. It's exactly the same thing. He said that, you build it for yourself in the future. It's not a unique perspective. It's something that we're starting to think about. So that was introduction. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about accessibility and security. And if there's one thing I want you to remember from this talk is this: CAPTCHAs are evil. I am willing to bet that not a single person in this room who does not have a disability did not have problem at one time or another completing a CAPTCHA. And you reload it once and you reload it twice, and it can take quite a few times before you do it. And my question to you guys is, why do we keep using this when it's difficult for us, considering it makes it impossible for other people? Why do we do it? Because it's the easier way out, isn't it? It's something that's out there. It's something that we're using. It works to some degree, but the pirates, the spammers, they're already out there trying to crack the next CAPTCHAs. There's outfits out there that you can actually go and buy a certain number of cracks. So you can hire someone to actually break CAPTCHAs for you. By default, CAPTCHAs are made to be hard to read, so screen readers can't read them. We're providing these audio alternatives that, well, with speech-to-text software can be cracked easily, so we don't want to make it too easy. We make it so garbled that we can't understand them. What can we do to make that easier? We can do a whole series of things. Not one implementation alone, but a series of things can be done. Excuse me. And depending on the context, depending on your application, depending on what you're doing, then you can select different things to do. The first thing to think about is that a lot of spam bots actually will harvest your form and then complete it from scripting somewhere else. So you can check if your script is being if the form is being submitted from your own domain. If it's not, well, you know it's a spammer, so you can kick it out immediately. That's an easy thing. You can build a honeypot. So what's a honeypot? You put in a form, a field, and you say, don't put anything in here. If there's something in there, we'll kick it out for spam. And the spam bots are stupid, really. They see a field, they put something in there. So if you have that field in there, then, hey, you're going to be reducing the amount of spam that comes through. But it's not just spam bots that are stupid, it's users. I'm sorry to say that, but a lot of people, they'll see something there and they think, oh my God, I have to fill in this form. So it's not sufficient to put that field in there. You can hide it off the screen with CSS. Suddenly, that form is not there. It's only going to be seen by the spam bot and screen readers. So what do you do about that? Then you can code the form to actually say to the screen reader, if with the proper labeling, hey, don't put anything in here. It's only for spam trapping. So that's one technique you can do. Kind of happens under the hood. It's not as effective as CAPTCHA, but it's also a lot more inclusive than CAPTCHA. Another thing is time limits. Chances are, if the form is completed under 2 seconds, it's not going to be a human that completed it, right? So you can actually time the amount of time that it takes between the time the form is loaded and the form is submitted. And then you can decide, well, we're going to give 1 second, 2 seconds, up to, I don't know, a certain amount of time. That can be tricky. We'll talk a little bit more about time limits later, how much time you give people, but you can really check for time limits and see if it's submitted too fast, then it gives you a good inkling. Another thing is two-step verification. Now, that doesn't really work in all situations. But what you do is, instead of submitting the data directly to the server, you send it to a second page, and you show the data to the user, and you say, hey, is this what you wanted to submit? Could you verify that this is the information you wanted to submit? And this gives you the opportunity, of course, to give the user a chance to change that if they want to change their submission. But the spam bots aren't going to go through this two-step process, because they see a form, they submit it, and then they think their job is done. So with this two-step verification, you can cut out more of the spam. Now, do you want that on a contact form? Maybe not, because maybe you'll irritate some of your users. Do you want that on a comment form on a blog? Well, I say yes, of course, because it's cutting spam bots, but it's also giving people a chance to reflect upon what they're submitting. And we all know that a lot of people will tap, and get really incensed about some of the discussion on the forum. And suddenly, if you give them a chance to read what they've written, suddenly it's like, I've actually written that. That's not what I wanted to say. So this is a case where accessibility actually benefits everyone. And there's a lot of cases like that where accessibility benefits everyone. So let's reflect on what we're doing. Now, a lot of people are advocating simple logic questions. What color is the sky? As a form. So if the person, say, doesn't answer the question properly, then you know it's a spam. That's fine, but what color is the sky? Is it that? Or is it that? Oh, suddenly we have a sunset with skies that have yellows and blues and purples, or we have blue. And is it midnight blue, or is it sky blue, or is it, we don't know. So these questions, it's one way to do it, but I would think it's perhaps not the best way. Eventually you run out of questions to ask. Is an elephant bigger than a mouse? That seems relatively easy to answer until you realize that there's a critter out there that looks like a mouse. It's called an elephant shrew. And you will always have that nitpicky user that actually is going to say, well, actually, it depends on the situation, and I can't answer your question, therefore, I can fill out your form. It goes back to reflection. Let's think about what we're doing and what possible implication it could have. Then this question of, is an elephant bigger than a mouse? Perhaps there's people that are really afraid of mice. Now that's silly to say, but perhaps there's people that are so afraid of mice that just the mere mention of a mouse will trigger them and say, oh, I can't handle this, and they're going to go away from your application. Do you care about that? Maybe not. I say, well, it's something we have to consider. It's that story of the guy with no arms that can't give a thumbprint. We could not plan for that. We don't know the situation that users are going to be in. So we have to look at as many different approaches to build our secure applications. Another favorite suggestion is simple math puzzles, which is fine, you know. 1 + 1 = 10. Yeah. Has anyone in this room heard of dyscalculia?
Yes.
Yes. For those who haven't heard of dyscalculia, it's a little bit like dyslexia. It's the inability to actually handle mathematics. It's simple. 1 + 1 = 2. Yeah, all right. But for some people, that's really a complex question. And it's not a question of intelligence. It's not a question of lack of education. It's really a question of brain wiring that just does not function. And even if it works for me, I'm not dyscalculic, but I never know if I need to respond with a numeral 1 or it's O and E. We don't know. So math questions, it's one way to do it, but it's not one that I would recommend. I mention it going back to this concept of reflection and consequences of what we're doing. Now, are you human? This is really one out of the realm of unintended consequences. It's a question that we see a lot for, checking that someone is actually not a spam bot. And I was working with a guy who developed a website for Holocaust survivors. And that question was right before a math problems or a logic question. I don't remember which one. But it turns out that are you human was a question asked during torture to dehumanize people. And it was used by the Nazis in the 40s. And it is still used to this day by various people who are using torture. So what happened when we asked that question, are you human, was that we were triggering immense PTSD in people, and suddenly they weren't able to use the site. So can we ask, are you human? Or should we ask, prove you're not a spam bot? Which one are we going to use? Unintended consequences. We have to think about what we're doing. We can't go blindly doing it without thought. Now, I mentioned earlier we can measure how long it takes for a form to be completed and submitted. I'm going away from CAPTCHAs and form validation, and I'm talking about how long does it take someone to fill out a form. Time sessions are really tricky because You as the developer build a form, and you see it, and you see it again, and you test it, and you fill it out, and you go through the process, and then you ask your boss to go through the process, and you get to know the form so well that you can go through it fairly quickly. Then you have user testing, and you take 50 people to go through the form, and you say, okay, the average is going to say it's taking half an hour for people to fill out this form. And horrible detail, you never considered that in your 50 users that you're using for testing, you don't have a single one that has dyslexia. You don't have a single one that is using a screen reader to find their way around the site. You don't have a single one that has cognitive impairments. And these are situations where it can take a lot of time to go through, especially if the form is complex. If you have, name, email, website, comment, submit, it's not so difficult. But when you're starting to look at, say, a registration form at university or a loan application form that are starting to be fairly complex, and you have extra information, you give people, click here to read the definitions of this, or see our terms of services, and make sure you've done this before you submit the form. Suddenly it can take quite a lot of time. So we have to think in terms of, do we really need this timing? Do we really need to limit the time that is necessary for a form? And sometimes, yeah, we do. If you're running an auction site and it's a countdown from 19 days to a week to a day, and suddenly it's the 10 last seconds, well, of course, that timing is essential and you have to keep it in there. But if it's not essential, you can do things to turn it off. You can give the users a chance to turn it off. You can have a tick box that say, it takes people on average half an hour to fill this form. If you think it's going to take you more time, you can turn off the timing and put a tick in there, and the moment the tick box isn't there, your timer stops. That's a fairly straightforward thing to do. Are people that don't need to stop the timing going to use it? Yeah, probably. So what? Unless the timing is essential to your application, you don't really need it there. But if you put it in there anyway, give people a chance to turn it off. Or give a chance to the people to extend timing. So say you get towards the end of the timing, and you can warn the users, this form is going to expire in 20 seconds. Would you like to extend timing? And you can give them as much as 10 times as long. So if you had a 10-minute delay, you can say, well, we can extend it by 100 minutes, for example. Yes?
Would you even care about how long you're running the form? If you're just trying to stop bots, really what you're trying to do is just say they can't. They build it out too fast.
Yes, that's a good question. The question is about, why do we care about how long it takes someone to fill a form to stop bots? I'm actually gone past the bots, and I'm talking in general about forms filling and time sessions for forms. Sometimes you do need to revalidate data, or to make sure that things don't take too long. I worked with a university recently, and their problem, they had to have timing put in because too many students started the registration process and then walked away without ever finishing it. And then they had all these half-completed submission forms. So they put in a timing. So basically, if it timed out without being completed, they didn't retain the data, which wasn't clogging their server. So there are situations where you need to restrict the amount of timing that you have for a user to complete a form, but you have to plan for users that may take longer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how related accessibility is security.
Security, because you may need timing to for your form, and accessibility because people with some disabilities need more time. So if you need to use that timing, you need to be able to provide a ways for users to turn it off, extend it, or refresh it. You can also extend the timing. So basically, you just give an option to give more time. Then there's question of re-authentication. Your user types in a form, and they time out. You didn't provide a way to extend timing, or they want to do it in several sessions. So if it's a big form, maybe they'll enter one bit and then they want to go back to it later. And it's a good idea to provide a way for users to get back to the point where they were at. Now, for many of us, it's just like, well, duh. It's basic UI stuff. You keep the data and you present it. But in a lot of situations, you don't have that ability to go back in. So from a security point of view, you want to keep the data secure and make it available. You can do that by... You don't have necessarily to write the data to a database if you go from one screen to another in the same process. Or you can decide to keep the data fresh, not fresh, but stored in a database so people can go back after logging in or whatnot. Some users with disabilities will switch between devices. So you can give them a way to access their data. A friend of mine uses a screen reader, and their preferred screen readers is NVDA on the PC, but sometimes it doesn't interact in the way that they want with the form, so they'll load up VoiceOver on their iPad to access the same thing because there's slightly different behaviors. So if they can't get back to the same data, then they've lost the time. So you want to give users a chance to re-authenticate and get back to the data that they had. And of course, form validation, that goes for stopping spam and all that. But it's very easy for us to check what is in the form. We can look at, if there's the same link plastered in the name and website and content, you can start suspecting that, it's been a bot that submitted that. You can do form validation straight at submission through JavaScript, but you also should use a fallback because not all assistive technology will interact well with your form validation. So send it to a page that can run the validation. So it's going to work for the majority of users that can use the JavaScript validation, but if they can't, then they're sent to the next page and are going to do that. Now, I've given you a lot of ideas about different things where security could interact with accessibility, and I have not spoken at all about the standards out there. And I've done that on purpose because it's a trap we fall into quite a bit, that we start treating accessibility as a checklist. And we look at the guideline and we say, all right, do I meet this point? Yes, check, I'm moving on. And I'd like us to take an approach much more in terms of, let's think about the barriers that we're avoiding or creating in our coding, and using the guidelines more as a guideline, something to help us figure out what the barriers could be. That said, the standard out there by the W3C, it's WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guideline. It's version 2.0, and it's quite useful set of guidelines that is broken down into four principles and then several guidelines, and each guidelines has several success criteria. So basically, you can say, well, does this image have alternative text? Yes, no. Do we need alternative text on that? And there's use cases in each time. If you're not familiar with them, I really invite you to go and spend some time on the WCAG website, because it makes for fascinating reading. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. It is like every other standards out there. It is technical writing, and it can get hard trudging to that, but it's important to do it. After the presentation, I'll be uploading my talk in the slides and an article about this talk, and I actually list out a whole series of those success criteria from WCAG as they may impact on security. So you'll be able to actually zoom in straight in there. I didn't want to give that to you on slides because it takes a little bit of time, but no, it's out there. No, there's accessibility guidelines that you can use. Also, on top of WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, there's another set of standards that's called ARIA, which is the Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a set of tools that allows you to make your JavaScript or other web-based application programmatically accessible by screen readers and other assistive technologies. And that's really important when we start looking at, we're using all this great JavaScript to make our application more secure, but if we're not giving assistive technologies a chance to interact with our content, then that's going to be difficult. So ARIA and WCAG. Resources, really briefly. Let's talk about WCAG. Let's talk about ARIA. Let's talk about me. I'm a resource for you. If you have a question, if you're wondering what's happening, why is this not working? Is this working? Is this accessible? Hey, Nick, we're thinking about doing this. Just talk to me, and yeah, let's go from there. I can be reached on Twitter all the time. I can be reached by my new website, incl.ca. I just moved there because I moved from New Zealand recently, so I'm changing to a Canadian domain. So you're welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to take questions or reflections or anything. Yep.
One company I worked for in the past, they've passed away, or refactored, whatever you want. Really, really low captchas, and we had another authentication method that still required human cognition, but it basically was, here are a number of pictures, here's a random letter on each picture, tell me which letter is on the cat. So out of these pictures you have to figure out, well, that's a cat, and pick the letter. How does that kind of feel from your perspective as, kind of when you test it against the other methods? Simple question.
The question is about another authentication method to prove you're not spam, which is putting random pictures and superimposing a letter on top of the picture, and then you have to answer, for example, which image has the letter R on top. So you have to say a cat or a dog or a car or whatnot. Or the other way around.
Sure, the person has which letter? You.
To me, that is a very clumsy way to make it happen, and I think it would be very difficult to make a system like that accessible, especially for screen reader users and for people with cognitive disabilities. I think that there's better ways to do that, but there might be a way to noodle out the code to make it work. But off the top of my head, I think that would be quite difficult to achieve.
I think it was designed to be resistant to machine interpretation originally, so...
Well, yes, resistant to machine interpretation, which goes back to this idea of CAPTCHA, which is, automating you just move the problem. Yeah. So how do you make an automated machine process resistant to automated machine processes? It's a bit of a, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Yes.
So it's easy to isolate bad examples, someone failing to implement these kinds of accessible authentication strategies. But is there, do you have an experience where there was an excellent example? Is there a shining standard for a website or an experience that does this very well?
The question is, do I have a shining example of a site that does accessibility very well? And I really can't answer you because off the top of my head, I can't think of a specific organization that does that very well. But probably not because they're not out there, but because when accessibility is done right, you don't actually notice it, right? So if it works smoothly, if it just goes, you don't see it. So unless you actually spend some time on thinking, hey, this actually went well, why did it go well? And, oh, that's how they did it. So, hey, yeah, it's a great example of accessibility. It can get a bit complicated to figure out exactly who does it really well.
Are you aware of any libraries or plugins that facilitate this well so that there can be some evolving standard of how to do it, as opposed to everybody follow their own tool?
The question is, am I aware of libraries that help with implementing these accessibility issues and security? Not really per se. I can tell you, for example, jQuery has done quite a bit of work to make sure that they have implemented accessibility in it. But other libraries, I'm not sure I could tell you that. Maybe Matt can answer off the top of his head of other libraries, but yeah.
It's one of those things where any of these products are only good in their own, in the situation, one situation or another. There isn't going to be something that I can recommend for all.
There's not one size fits all. What's going to work for one may not necessarily work for another. It comes back to trying to meet the standards, really. I think that's about the time we had. I will be around. If you have questions, grab me, unless I go too fast by you. But I'm good at responding to Twitter and email. So thank you for coming, and hopefully you'll go back leaving this with some reflection and some ideas to go forward. Thank you. Oh, and don't